G'day and welcome to this explainer. I am so glad you could tune in with us today. Look, if you're involved with a self-managed super fund, or SMSF, and you've been hearing a bunch of chatter lately about residential property rules, well, you've landed in exactly the right place. Today, we're going to calmly and methodically unpack a pretty huge legislative change that's rolling out on the 10th of August 2026. Basically, from that date forward, new limited recourse borrowing arrangements, what we usually just call LRBAs, they can no longer be used to fund the purchase of residential property through an SMSF. Now, just to be super clear right off the bat, my goal today is absolutely not to tell you whether you should or shouldn't buy property through your fund. That's entirely up to you and your professional advisors. Instead, what we're doing here is walking through a highly practical plain English checklist. We're going to look at exactly what you need to review, why your documentation has to be completely spot on, and the very specific dates you need to circle on your calendar. All right, let's jump straight into it.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. Number 1, the 2026 rule change. Number 2, the property purchase checklist. Number 3, why getting it right matters. And number 4, the bigger picture.
Let's start with Section 1, the 2026 rule change. What you need to know about the upcoming deadline.
So first things first, it is incredibly important that we separate the actual signing of your contract from the final settlement of the property. Now, the rule officially flips on the 10th of August 2026. On that exact day, the door firmly closes on using new LRBAs for residential SMSF purchases. But take a close look at that first date on the timeline, the 9th of August 2026. That is your actual practical deadline. You see, to fund a new residential purchase with an LRBA, you absolutely must have a legally acceptable contract of sales signed and dated on or before that 9th of August date. If you've got that sorted, great. Your application can proceed and the actual settlement of the property can comfortably happen well after the 10th of August. It's the signing date that locks you in.
Now, while we're talking about changes, it's equally crucial to understand what is not changing, because honestly, there's no need for any unnecessary panic here. The new rules strictly affect new LRBAs for residential property purchases. That's the boundary line. If you already have an existing SMSF loan for a residential property, you are perfectly fine to still refinance that LRBA to another lender down the track. And on top of that, if your SMF is buying a commercial property, you are entirely exempt from this change altogether. The new rule is laser-focused strictly on borrowing for new residential properties.
Moving right along to Section 2, Property Purchase Checklist. 3 practical steps for your documentation.
You know, the most common errors we see in SMSF property purchases almost always come down to the contract of sale itself. And because we have this incredibly strict deadline looming, making sure your documentation is flawless is quite literally more important than ever. We've distilled the heavy lifting down into 3 really straightforward, practical steps for your review process. Step 1 is getting the purchaser name right. Step 2 is ensuring you are purchasing a single acquirable asset. And Step 3 is addressing your bare trust needs early. Let's unpack each of these so you know exactly what to look for.
All right, Step 1, get the purchaser name right. Now, I know this sounds ridiculously simple, but believe me, it's a massive stumbling block. You've got to ensure that the contract of sale identifies the exact, correct legal purchasing entity right from day one. In the world of SMSFs, getting the entity name slightly wrong, like even just a tiny bit off, isn't just a typo. It can fundamentally invalidate the entire contract. And honestly, that is a huge risk when you're racing against a hard legislative deadline.
And speaking of that legal entity name, there's a really specific nuance you need to watch out for depending on what state you're in. If you're buying property down in Victoria or over in South Australia, you need to pay very close attention to the and/nominee clause. If your purchase contract has been executed using this specific wording, you really need to pause and consider what extra legal or administrative steps might be required to solidify who the actual purchasing entity is well before that 10th of August 2026 deadline hits.
Okay, let's look at Step 2. Keep it to a single acquirable asset. So the deal here is that under SMSF borrowing rules, an LRBA can only ever be used to purchase a single acquirable asset. But what does that actually mean in plain English? Well, it means the contract of sale needs to clearly reflect one single property asset. You can't just bundle a bunch of multiple distinct asset descriptions together onto the one loan arrangement. It has to be just one single thing.
Now, this is where it can get a little bit fiddly, particularly in Victoria. You really need to scrutinize the property details if it includes things like accessory lots, certain restrictions, a completely separate second title just for the garage, or even an external storage space. If the property you're looking at has these features, you must double-check that the appropriate restrictions are documented correctly and that these separate pieces are legally tied together to be sold as one single package. Because if they aren't legally tied together, the authorities might view them as multiple assets, and that would instantly breach the rule.
Which brings us to a pretty major warning for this whole checklist. You might be wondering, why are we obsessing so much over getting the name and the asset description so perfect right now? Well, because from the 10th of August 2026, it will literally not be possible to rescind or revise a contract of sale for these purchases. If you wake up on the 11th of August and suddenly realize your contract has the wrong entity name or it accidentally bundles multiple assets, you won't be able to just tear it up, revise the details, and sign a fresh one under the old rules. The window for new residential LRBAs will have completely closed by then.
All right, the final step on our checklist. Step 3, address your bare trust needs early. Whenever an SMSF uses an LRBA, the property is held in what's called a bare trust until the loan is fully paid off. But here's the catch. Bare trusts are governed by state-based trust laws. That means the timing and the whole process for establishing and executing that bare trust deed can vary pretty wildly depending on which jurisdiction the transaction is happening in. It is definitely not a one-size-fits-all timeline, so you really have to factor this in nice and early to make sure all your legal structures are securely standing before that contract deadline.
That takes us to Section 3, Why Getting It Right Matters. The consequences of missing crucial details.
Now look, my role here isn't to be alarmist, but we do have to be realistic about the practical consequences of missing these details. Addressing these matters early on simply clears the road for a much smoother, stress-free path to settlement. Because if your documentation isn't thoroughly reviewed, 3 main things are likely to happen. First, it could delay the purchase entirely, leaving you scrabbling around at the last minute to fix legal errors. Second, it can create some major headaches in actually meeting your settlement obligations with the vendor. And third, falling foul of SMSF compliance rules can, in some worst-case scenarios, lead to significant penalties. So getting it right the first time genuinely avoids all of these massive headaches.
Finally, Section 4, the bigger picture. Recapping the exemptions and keeping perspective.
You know, whenever a big legislative deadline is approaching, it's super easy to get tunnel vision. So let's just zoom out for a second and recap what we've covered to keep everything in its proper perspective. Remember, the current rules remain your friend, provided you actually meet the criteria. These upcoming changes do not apply to you if you successfully get a legally acceptable contract of sale signed on or before the 9th of August 2026. They do not apply if you are simply refinancing an existing SMSF residential loan, and they absolutely do not apply to commercial property purchases. If you fall into those specific buckets, you can breathe easy. But for everyone else, well, the clock is ticking. August 2026 might feel like it's ages away, but in the slow-moving world of property settlement and trust law, it's pretty much just around the corner. So the question is, will your SMSF strategy be ready when that deadline hits?
This content is general and educational. It is not financial advice, legal advice, or tax advice. If you are considering an SMSF property purchase or want to understand your compliance obligations, seek professional advice appropriate to your circumstances.